started. It's great to see you all for this third session. So the first week we introduced Christianity in the Middle East. Last week we talked about the history of, or we talked about Christian life in the Islamic Middle East and Christian relations, and we're slowly progressing in history toward present. So today we'll be talking about Christianity and geopolitics in the Middle East. The session is going to examine some of the shifts in Middle Eastern Christian life over the past century and a half or so, drawing on my research on Middle Eastern churches in the Americas, which is a project that I've been working on over the past several years, and especially during my sabbatical. And we're going to consider the geopolitical events that have led Christians to migrate from the Middle East into the Americas in higher numbers in recent years. So as a reminder, for those of you who were here, here are the 5 Middle Eastern church families. And if there's anybody who's here for the first time, I do have a few copies left over. Anybody need a copy of this chart? So that we have 5 families. The Oriental Orthodox and the Church of the East are the 2 families that are the most unique to the Middle East and that you don't find so much elsewhere except for in the diaspora after people have migrated. You have an Eastern Orthodox Arab family that's connected to the Eastern, that is connected to Eastern Orthodox churches such as the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox. You have a wide variety of Catholic churches, Catholic rites that are within the Catholic communion but aren't Roman Catholic. And then you have an even larger number of Protestant churches that have missionary origins in the 19th century. So just as a reminder, along with the Church of the East and the Oriental Orthodox that I said are really unique to the Middle East, you also have a number of Syriac traditions. Syriac is basically another word for Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and so some of these traditions have retained that in their liturgy, and many of them actually in the vernacular that people speak even at home. And so you see where I've labeled West Syriac tradition and East Syriac tradition. And all of these traditions, except for the Maronite Church today, speak Syriac, identify as being ethnically related to the Syriac people. The Maronite Church is living in an Arab context, and so Arabic is their native language, and they haven't retained a vernacular that's Syriac, but they still use the Aramaic in their churches. So those are the 5 Middle Eastern church families that we'll continue to refer to. But today's question is, what has shaped modern Middle Eastern Christianity? And so I have 4 things that are really interconnected that I want to talk about today. There's European and American missionary activities, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. The Orthodox activities are mainly Russian Orthodox. That's important for the history of the Middle East, but especially for Middle Eastern Christianity. There are Western and other external powers that have influenced things that have happened in the Middle East and to Middle Eastern Christians. That includes colonial and imperial forces, military powers, as well as economic pressure that continues even to today. There's the very recent shift from empires to nation states that comes really after World War I, and then decades under colonial rule, and then post-colonial situations. As part of this, we have different religious and ethnic national movements, and then there's also migration, reasons why Middle Eastern Christians, as well as others from the Middle East, have decided to either leave and move to a different part of the region, or to leave the region altogether. But we're going to look at the first 2 together and the second 2 together today. But first, here's just a reminder of the Ottoman Empire map. So we were talking about Christian-Muslim relations in the multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious Ottoman Empire, which was really the predominant empire in the world, or at least in the Mediterranean, and can even from the perspective of Europeans for centuries. This is a picture of the Ottoman Empire at its height in the 17th century, as well as the neighboring Persian Empire, which was at that time the Safavid Empire. So you see that on the edge where Iran is today. Those are kind of the 2 imperial contexts that we're going to be talking about that changed into this map that we have today, and it's on the back side of your handout if you got one. And so today, the three dominant ethno-linguistic groups in the Middle East, especially that we'll be talking about, are Arabic speakers, Persian speakers, and Turkish speakers, so you can kind of see with the shading where those lie on the map. Now I wanted to turn to one of the forces shaping Middle Eastern life, and that is missionaries, including Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox. And I'm just going to go through kind of the key impacts of each tradition. So for Catholics, these are mostly French and Italian, other European Catholics as well, since the 16th century. So that's the longest in terms of the history of outsiders, Christians outside the Middle East coming into the Middle East as missionaries. And so then I've shown you the 7 different Roman Catholic rites that are present in the Middle East, or the Catholic rites that are present in the Middle East. The Roman Catholic wasn't really present before the missionaries came, but as a result, there are now Roman Catholic churches, educational and medical institutions in the Middle East. The Maronite Catholic Church is the main church that traces its history to the Catholic communion that was always present in the Middle East. That's the West Syriac or Aramaic-speaking, originally Aramaic-speaking tradition. And for them, the impact was a strengthening of Maronite French ties, especially, and those ties continued throughout the centuries of Ottoman rule, really up to present for many of the Maronite communities, even in Lebanon today. And then you have new Catholic rites, all of which came out of existing Orthodox communities in the Middle East, but united with Rome and retained their unique languages, their unique liturgies and traditions of the Orthodox churches. So that was the impact of Catholic missions, is to kind of diversify what Catholicism looks like in the Middle East. So for these Catholic missionaries, their focus was existing Catholics, which would be the Maronites, and Orthodox Christians. They weren't so much focused on converting Muslims into Catholicism in those centuries. The impact of Orthodox missions, which was primarily the Russian Orthodox and imperial mission sent by the Russian Tsar, was first within the Antiochian Orthodox Patriarchate of Damascus, which is the largest Arab Eastern Orthodox community. It switched from Greek liturgy to Arabic liturgy through Russian influence to sort of set aside some of the national or ethnic Greek control. So basically, up to that point, only Greek patriarchs had been in control of an Arabic-speaking Orthodox community. And so the switch from Greek to Arabic in the liturgy, and the switch from Greek to Arab patriarchs within the Antiochian Orthodox Church is really important. Also, Arab Orthodox clergy and scholars began to study in Russia, and so you see those connections, especially within the Orthodox communities. And then the first missions to Arab Orthodox communities who migrated to the United States, to the Americas, is actually not sponsored by the Antiochian Orthodox Arab Patriarchate, which was at that time under the Ottoman Empire. It's sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church, which is really interesting. So it shows you the interconnections between these independent Eastern Orthodox communities. And the mission focus for the Russian Orthodox Church in the Middle East was just Middle Eastern Orthodox Christians. They wanted to have influence over those communities, help them shape themselves in a certain way. They weren't looking in that area of the world to expand through missions to other communities. And then finally, the impacts on Protestant missions. I've listed the mainline Protestant churches across the Middle East. You have the first Protestant congregations in the region, first in Istanbul in 1846, then in Beirut in 1848. So those are both Armenian-speaking and Arabic-speaking Protestant communities. You have printing presses, which are important for Protestants because we always want to translate the Bible into the language of the people, and that has an educational impact and a cultural impact in those communities, as well as a religious one. You have many hospitals, schools, and universities. The two probably best known in the Middle East are the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo, both of which have American Protestant missionary origins. And the Protestants, although they will tell you that they focused on everyone, because they really wanted, whether you're Christian or not, to become part of the Protestant denominations, their focus of missions was primarily Catholics and Orthodox as well. Some mission societies did focus on converting Muslims and Jews, but those were only particular societies. And it was, I think, largely because those communities were really close to evangelization and proselytization. So most of these communities in the Middle East that became Protestant came from existing Christian communities, and all of those that are on the charts that I showed you. So what should you know about missionaries? They built lasting, positive relationships with Middle Eastern Christians. They contributed humanitarian, medical, educational infrastructure beyond the faith traditions that they passed down. They also often, maybe too often, displayed cultural superiority. This sort of prejudicial approach to people's cultures sometimes disrupted local Christian-Muslim relations. Sometimes they failed to protect their Christian partners from the consequences of those disruptions. And so there's a tension there in understanding what missionaries did. Some were very open to local cultures, others wouldn't, and we all carry our own biases with us. And so I think one of the most unfortunate things, though, is that Middle Eastern Christians have sometimes felt more of an affinity with Western Christians than Western Christians feel with them, or they've felt an expectation that they would be protected for many of the dangers that they face. And missionaries and other Western Christians are not always able to do so, and sometimes are not interested in doing so. And so you see the tension in that history. And then you see that missionaries benefited from and sometimes served the interests of Western colonialism. Whether it was just that they were free to go into a certain area because it had been colonized by European power. Sometimes the ties were closer. Sometimes missionaries also challenged what colonial powers were doing. So it's a complicated history, but I wanted to lift up the tension in that piece. And with that mention of colonialism, that leads me to the next topic, which is colonialism in the Middle East and North Africa. And mostly when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about European and American Christian powers coming into different parts of the world, but particularly the Middle East and North Africa. So as a reminder again, this is what the map looked like in the 17th century. So Catholic missionaries are already coming at this point. Protestant missionaries come in the 19th century, and it's really the late 18th, early 19th century when European powers start growing strong enough to think about challenging the Ottoman Empire. And so it's in 1798, for a couple short-lived years, Napoleon's French army occupies Egypt, and that's understood as kind of the beginning of European powers encroaching into the Ottoman Empire. But it actually lasted quite a long time after that, and Napoleon wasn't successful, and he had to leave Egypt after a couple of years. But the shifts since the 19th century in the Middle East, so you have the Turkish Ottoman Empire that includes also a very large region of Arabs, and then you have the Persian Empire, which by this point is changed to a different dynasty called the Qajar dynasty. The Ottoman Empire over the 19th century shrinks, and the early 20th century shrinks to West Asia, which means Anatolia, present-day Turkey, and the Levant, the Arab world kind of along the Mediterranean coast. And it collapses in the aftermath of World War I. Then in 1923, the Republic of Turkey is established, and that's just in Anatolia. And then for the Persian Emperor, the Persian dynasty, there's not direct colonialism actually during this period, but there's a fight between the British and the Russians for influence. And so building those ties to influence the Persian dynasty, and also a little bit later to gain access to oil fields. So it's not until 1925 where there's a shift. The Qajar dynasty in the aftermath of World War I is replaced by the Pahlavi dynasty. If you've heard anything about Iran, you might have heard about the Pahlavis. And so this is Reza Shah I. You talk about the Shah of Iran. He renamed the country Iran in 1935, and then passed things on to his son, Mohammad Reza Shah II, in 1941. And he is the one who is ousted from power in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. He also brought Iran closer to ties with the British. So if anybody's watched the video that we sent out about Iran, you will have heard his name and his tie to the British. So in terms of Western colonialism in the Middle East, it's happening on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire, but not in the central regions, the Arab West Asia and in Turkey. But for example, in 1821, Greece gains independence. That's through a war, not through colonization, but there's a shrinking of the Ottoman Empire at that point. Then in terms of colonization, in 1830, France takes Algeria, has a long history of colonialism there. The British take Egypt in 1882, and it's kind of semi-colonial. They couldn't quite kick out all of the Ottomans, but so they have an interesting power-sharing relationship with them as an occupying power. Italy takes Libya in 1911, and then the Balkans gain their independence right before World War I. So that's what happens in the Ottoman Empire, and you can see it on this map. So the central Ottoman lands in the dark gray remain uncolonized. It remains part of the Ottoman Empire, and there's no direct military or colonial power in those regions, but the British are in Egypt, the Italians are in Libya, the French are in Algeria. The British are also colonizing the edges of the Arabian Empire or the Arabian Peninsula. This becomes important for oil later on. And then the last thing, which I think is quite interesting, I don't know how well you can see on this map, is to say that different, you can sort of line up where missionaries went based on where the colonial and European powers were interested in. So for example, well, of course, in historic Palestine, everybody wants to go there, but especially the British were there, the Russians were also there, the Russians are in orange. In Egypt, you have British, you have Americans. Often Americans went where the British were, where British missionaries were, or where the British controlled. They had kind of an affinity with Britain because it wasn't an American empire. Yeah.
Question of clarification about American. When you say American, do you mean the U.S. or all of the Americas?
Yeah, I mean the U.S. Yeah, so in terms of missionaries, U.S. Protestant missionaries were really, in terms of numbers, were huge in the Middle East. Some Canadian Protestants had their own missionary organizations too, but not so much in the Middle East. And at that time, in terms of Latin America, there wasn't so much of a missionary movement that was going on beyond those bounds.
How much of the interplay existed between colonialism and mission? Because there was a time in which the Christian churches became very mission focused, and wasn't that mostly what, 18th, 19th century?
Yeah.
And so was there an overlap?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a really big overlap. And if you saw the map of the world, you can see this in even closer focus. So so for example, when the British took India, many Protestant missionary groups said it was providential. We're opening up this land, so Britain is controlling economically, militarily the land, right? But it also means that missionaries are free to establish themselves there. Many of them were already there, but now they're free to proselytize in ways that they couldn't before when the rulers are of other religious traditions, if that makes sense. So Egypt, for example, became a little bit more open to evangelization of Muslims, meaning that there wasn't a government in place that could prohibit that. And so I study more specifically Protestant missionaries in Syria, which was always under the Ottoman Empire, until it was never colonized. And missionaries there really had to focus just on other Christians. And not on Muslims. And if they wanted to, for example, sometimes they did produce evangelistic literature that was aimed at Muslims. They would print it in Egypt so it wouldn't get censored by the Ottoman press in Syria, and then they would sort of smuggle it into Syria and distribute it among Muslim groups. So it doesn't mean that there wasn't contact between missionaries and Muslims, but you had to be more careful when your authorities were not British Protestants who weren't going to prosecute you for trying to convert Muslims, if that makes sense. So there was, and it really depends. For Americans, there wasn't an empire at this time, and so their relationship with colonialism was a little bit different. But for the British, it was, and colonization opened the land for the for missionaries to come in, but also missionaries who were already there were important contacts for colonial administrators. So it kind of worked back and forth. I think I saw another question.
Well, what was that NEGD?
That's just the name for kind of the desert in the Ottoman, or in the Arabian Peninsula. That's just so at this time, there's no Saudi Arabia, there are no independent states in the peninsula, but it's a very deserty, dry area, and the reason why it's independent is because there isn't something that outside powers want to come in and take. If that makes sense. So the last thing I'll say in terms of the map, and then open for any further questions, is that this is what the central areas of the Middle East, which were under the Ottoman Empire, looked like after World War I. So this is the creation of the French and the British mandates. These Arab regions wanted independence, but it wasn't granted in the post-World War I treaties. And so Syria and Lebanon had a stronger French presence historically, but also especially after the war. And so they became mandates, which basically means they're under French colonial power. And then for the British, they had a stronger presence in Palestine and Transjordan and in what becomes Iraq. And so those regions fell to the British. And it was for that reason, for example, that the British played such a key role in the conflicts leading up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So before we talk more about the...
So essentially you're saying none of it was local control, none of it was organically organized by the boundaries, it was all created really by foreign powers.
Sure, I mean the concept of nation states is a relatively new concept. The idea that people who all speak the same language, have the same ethnicity, and have the same land should live in a bounded area with one leader and be a nation. It's new, and it's not true certainly to the diversity of the Middle East. But yeah, so Turkey is independent at this point. Iran is also independent. There's not a mandate of Iran, but for the regions that become Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel today, they wanted their independence, and they were not granted it after World War I, and so they had to fight for that. But it comes after World War II. So these boundaries are artificial. Some of them make sense for the people who are living there, and some of them don't. And you can see the same thing in Africa and in other parts of the world that are colonized. But the boundaries only make sense for the powers that are sort of fighting to control the land that's there.
Yeah, I just want to recommend a very interesting book on that subject of the French and Brit influence in the Middle East. It's called Lawrence in Arabia, not Lawrence of Arabia, but it's a very detailed and interesting account of how the middle, that part of the world was divided up.
Okay, Lawrence in Arabia, because Lawrence of Arabia is also well known, and partly because of his work with people in Arabia. Saudi Arabia, what exists as Saudi Arabia today, it was very strongly influenced by the British, but it wasn't colonized, so you don't see that as a mandate either. But this is what things looked like after World War I, and then they changed quite dramatically after World War II. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the shifts after World War I, but if there are any other questions before we move on.
What role did tribes play? I remember reading where the king of Egypt had a lottery and everybody had to pick a different last name because the tribes were a source of conflict and politics and faith.
Yeah, so in certain regions of the Middle East, tribal affiliations, I mean, that's your family name, and I think you can still trace it in terms of some family names, so in the Arabian Peninsula, tribes would have quite a lot of control over, and it's which dynasty comes into power, that's connected to a local tribe. Does that answer your question?
Did any missionaries go after one particular group of families, or did it get that granular?
Yeah, so Yeah, so in terms of, like, the places where tribes really come into play are places where there are large spans of desert, and tribes are nomadic initially. So in Egypt, that would have been the case in the Arabian Peninsula, and in some regions near Syria as well, Syria and Lebanon. In the missionaries that I have studied, they tended to go to cities and rural areas, and every once in a while there would be a missionary that was devoted to, like, who they would call the Bedouin, the Arabs who were nomadic. But they're not a settled people, so it's hard to kind of establish yourselves, because what missionaries did is they built schools, they built hospitals, they built churches, they built printing presses. These are all established things that they need a land to stay on. They need the people to be centered around that land, and they need the infrastructure. So in terms of their work with Arab Bedouin tribes, there certainly were, sometimes that work happened, but it wasn't really the focus. The biggest missionary presence would be like in Beirut, for example. That's the largest city in Lebanon, or be in Cairo, the largest city in Egypt. So a little bit less, and I think maybe because they didn't see the tribes as having as much influence over the wider society. But that's a really interesting question.
So what was the results of in the Middle East of the Crusades? I mean, how much of this Christian missionary focus was still a residual of the mindset that the Christians should take over Jerusalem, for instance?
Yeah, I think in terms of that idea that we're the true Christians now, those who live outside of the Middle East, and we should go back and take the land. I think that that sort of mindset was present for some. Not all missionaries. I think that I think that some missionaries were very sensitive to the local situation. But in terms of the Crusades as a sort of I think is a political movement more than a religious movement, but certainly for Catholics at that time it was important. And I would say even for Protestants who kind of inherited the missionary legacy, yeah, I think there's a crusader mindset that. But Protestant missionaries at this time would talk about spiritual crusades, right? That's better. That's better than military crusades. So I think there is some of that. Well, let's turn now to the post. Oh, yeah.
You talked about the Russian Orthodox that came in, and they actually sponsored more moving to America. But did they stay after the Bolshevik Revolution, continue to support like Iran? Was that part of that Cold War? Because it's like, oh, that's the Russians. No, it's the Russian church who might have been escaped to that area. I don't know.
Yeah, so for Russian presence in the Middle East in terms of their missions, because it was the Tsar's mission, that only lasted until the revolution, and that was done in terms of.
But there was some Russian connection.
There was still a connection to the Russian Orthodox Church. I think that the Arab Orthodox felt that I think that's also part of the reason why the Arab Orthodox Antiochian Church, centered in Damascus, is so kind of immersed in local Arab culture, because after that point it didn't have kind of a political religious power outside the Middle East that was influencing it. And so the Russian kind of presence for that short period of time is really important. And then in the U.S., Russian Orthodox missions happened like in Alaska, and so because they were already present, when Arabs started migrating in the late 19th century to the U.S., for those who were Orthodox, the Russians were a connection. And so Arabs were not migrating because of any connection to Russia, but this is kind of the beginning of the migrations of Middle Eastern Christians from Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. That starts in the late 19th century, which is what we'll talk about now. Okay, so we're turning to the past 100 years or so. We have about maybe 15, 20 minutes to talk about the last 100 years and then answer a few more questions. But I want to consider the story of Middle Eastern Christian migration as sort of tied up with the shifts in the Middle East in the past 100 years. So in terms of what you should know, World War I was a major turning point. The end of the Ottoman Empire, it's the beginning of the French and British Mandates, really the first experience in the central Middle East of colonization outside of North Africa. And then you Those are Armenian refugees, but also refugees from the Syriac tradition, Syriac Orthodox, Assyrians, the Chaldean Catholic Church. Secondly, you have Middle Eastern nations who gained political independence between the 1940s and 1970. They're often remaining under British and Russian or increasing American influence, but they are gaining actual political independence. They're not under mandates anymore. And then Christian migration over this period is driven by economic need, but also by political instability and violence, and sometimes unfounded sense of connection to Western Christian nations. So I'm Christian, I'm leaving the Middle East, I have some connections to American missionaries, so I'm going to New York, and they'll take care of me. And you see when you get to New York, maybe there are some lingering connections, but usually it is the people who migrate from a certain region of the Ottoman Empire congregate in a certain neighborhood in New York City, and that becomes the Syrian colony or the Syrian neighborhood, and they're taking care of themselves. And it's an open question whether they're welcomed with open arms or not. So here are the waves of Middle Eastern Christian migration. There's an early wave in the late 19th century, as I already mentioned, of Arabs from Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. They're coming mostly for economic reasons. Then you have genocide refugees that I also mentioned from 1915 during World War I, and then the aftermath, because where have people who've escaped the genocide, where are they going to go? A lot of Armenians come to the US as well as to Argentina and Brazil, for example. Assyrians and Chaldeans mostly came to the US, where they had some established communities in New York already and in Michigan. And from the 1940s to 1960s, you get waves of Palestinian refugees. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But who are the Palestinian Christians then who are migrating? Those are the Melkite Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Arabs, and as well as a smaller number of Roman Catholics. That's mostly who the Christians are in Palestine. From the 60s to 80s, because of what's going on in Egypt, you have immigration of Egyptian Copts. You also have, around the same time, the Lebanese Civil War, and so that would mean Maronites, Eastern Orthodox, as well as many Armenians who relocated from Turkey to Lebanon are also migrating to get away from the Lebanese Civil War. In Iran, you have the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and so in the decades following, the Christians there are also migrating, and those would be mostly Armenians as well as Assyrians. And then more recently, we have refugees from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, with various conflicts related to the Arab Spring that I've listed there. That brings us somewhat up to present. So migration over the past century has been a regular part of Middle Eastern Christian life. Not always from the same places, but depending on what is happening across the Middle East, you get waves of Christians from these 5 different Middle Eastern traditions. So I wanted to share some words from Mitri Raheb, who's a Palestinian theologian, professor, scholar, and a Lutheran pastor, about the political context for Middle Eastern Christians and why it is that they found their way into the Americas as well as other parts of the world as migrants. So he says, over the last 2 centuries, the Middle East has experienced 27 wars, an average of 1 war every 8 years. The number of Middle Eastern countries affected by conflict grew from 5 in 2002 to 11 in 2016. The region never recovered from the neocolonialism of the first half of the 20th century, including the implanting of Israel at the heart of the region, nor from the many wars and civil wars that became a marker of the second half of the 20th century. Nor can we ignore the influence of 3 regional powers over the past 5 decades: Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and their religious affiliations as Jewish, Muslim Sunni, and Muslim Shiite states. Within this geopolitical triangle, Christians are not players, but are most often collateral damage. So the reality for Middle Eastern Christians is that they have not been. I misspelled political. They have not been major political players in their countries, except in Lebanon. That's an exception because of the Maronite community was both populist as well as politically tied to France. So those colonial powers sometimes do work in the favor of Christians. But for the whole, they haven't been major political players. And so in terms of how political situations have turned out, they're waiting for others to make those decisions. But it's also important to know that Christians have made important social, economic, and cultural contributions. They've partnered with Muslims, who are the majority in most cases, in movements like Arab nationalist political movements, as well as other cultural and social movements. So there have been important ties, even though Christians are minorities. And then there's the kind of external reality that Western nations have pursued political and economic interests in the Middle East, regardless of the consequences for the region as a whole and for its Christians in particular. And so sometimes the plight of Middle Eastern Christians is used to justify Western political or military action. But you always need to ask yourself afterwards if it actually helped the Christians on the ground. And the pattern over the past 100 years has been that Christians are migrating to get out of difficult situations. Sometimes they're more able to migrate than their Muslim neighbors, for example, because they do have connections to Christians elsewhere. They have, because of the long history of Christian migration, they have family. If you drop yourself in any part of the Arab Middle East at least, and ask a Christian where their family members are, they will have family in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, and Latin America. And so there's always a possible connection point for leaving if you need to leave. You should also know that the Christian population of the Middle East is continuing to grow numerically, so it's not that it's shrinking. It's just that the Christian percentage in the region has declined, and that's due both to lower birth rates than most of their Muslim neighbors, as well as immigration. There are also some regions and some periods of time where the percentage has also, or the numerical number has also declined. In Iraq, for example, where U.S. occupation as well as politics on the ground has really pushed out a lot of Iraqi Christians.
Just on that, what enables the numerical growth? Is it existing Christians having babies, or is it conversion, their neighbors, Islam converting over, or is it immigration in, or what is it?
Yeah, so in most cases, I would say it's just regular population growth. There are more Christians living in the Middle East now than there were in the year 1900, because there are more people in the world. It's just the way that, but it's not so drastic that Middle Eastern Christians are disappearing, and sometimes we hear that, and then we don't attune ourselves to the people who are actually there. So that's really the point that, the point that I'm making.
Yeah, because everything you've said up to this point would lead me to think that the number of Christians is shrinking, and you're saying it's not real.
Yeah, so there is a Christian presence, most places, not everywhere, but in most places there's still a Christian presence, but I think it's becoming more precarious. In certain places, like Gaza, for example, people are asking, will there be Christians there in the next 10 years? In some parts of Iraq, that question has also been asked. So in my own research, which is now focusing on Middle Eastern Christians in the Americas, both North and South America, I'm finding that, or I'm wanting people to also recognize that Middle Eastern Christianity, it exists in the Middle East, but it also exists around us. And so it has survived and it's thrived in the diaspora through the founding of immigrant churches, but also more recently through converts from non-Middle Eastern backgrounds. It's actually in the diaspora, to answer your other question, where more conversions are happening from outside of Middle Eastern Christianity. There are certain parts of the Middle East where there are accounts of Muslims converting, and it's difficult to know about those numbers. But in terms of those who are joining Middle Eastern Christian churches, it's often happening in the diaspora, in the Orthodox churches, which is really interesting as well. So here's just a little timeline of Middle Eastern migration to the Americas, and you can see kind of those waves that I mentioned before, who's going where. In the 1890s and in post-World War I, you have Armenians going to the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina. A little bit before that, you had more Arabs that were migrating. In 1924, the US has immigration restrictions, which kind of stops that flow, and so even more Middle Easterners are looking to Latin America. So there's really a large Middle Eastern Christian presence in Latin America. And then I've named a few of the first churches in the Americas. So the first Maronite church was in Lower Manhattan, established in 1890. And this is the cornerstone of that church, St. Joseph's Church, which is now shown in the cathedral, which is in Brooklyn, but it was found when they were excavating the rubble after 9/11, after the collapse of the Twin Towers. And so this original church was in the vicinity of where the Twin Towers were. And then more recently, you can also see the different communities that have migrated. So the first Coptic Orthodox church in the U.S. wasn't founded until 1968 in Jersey City, where a lot of Copts still migrate today. So you have Lebanese who were in New York in the late 19th century, and then it's not until after the mid-20th century where you have more Egyptians that are coming. So that really kind of depends on what's happening in different parts of the Middle East. But to highlight just one of these contexts where I visited churches recently and conducted interviews, I wanted to turn to Orthodox Palestinians in Chile, just to tell part of the story of Palestinian Christianity that's maybe not as well known. So more Palestinians live today in Chile than in any other country outside the Middle East. It's estimated to be 500,000 or about 500,000 Chilean Palestinians, or sometimes they're called Chilecinos, and almost all of these are Christian. The waves of Palestinian immigration to Chile from the late 1940s to present have coincided with the creation of the State of Israel and its subsequent occupation of Palestinian territory. The presence of Palestinians in Santiago, which is the capital of Chile, was already, though, significant enough in the aftermath of World War I that the famous Chilean Palestinian football team was created there in 1920, or at least it's famous in Latin America. I don't know if anybody here has heard of it. And in 1938, a social club and sports facility called Club Palestino, the Palestinian Club, came into being as a central gathering place for the community. Subsequent waves of migration to Chile occurred with the Nakba of 1947 to 1948. So this is the displacement of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the creation of the State of Israel. And then the Naksa, which means in Arabic the catastrophe, or the War of 1967, during which Israel occupied all the way up to the west bank of the Jordan River. And also during the intifadas, or the Palestinian uprisings that started in the late 1980s, we have another wave of immigration. So Palestinians, and particularly Palestinian Christians, have been migrating, especially since the 1940s. So this is St. Mary's Church in Santiago, the church that I spent the most time in last summer when I was there. Now, if you know anything about Chile, you know that sociopolitically it underwent radical change in the late 20th century. First with the dictator Pinochet taking power in 1973, and then with the end of the dictatorship and return to democracy in the early 1990s. Today, amidst political polarization between right-wing and left-wing parties that are kind of picking up the pieces after the dictatorship, Palestinian Chilenos find themselves on both sides of that political divide. But what's interesting is that the struggle for Palestine is a central focus for many of these Palestinian Chileans, despite the fact that most of their families have been settled in Chile for generations, and there are other, probably more pressing local political concerns. But with regard to the history of the Orthodox Arab Church in Chile, the first priest arrived in 1910, and the first Chilean Orthodox Church, the Cathedral of St. George, was inaugurated in Santiago in 1917. Although over the generations, many Palestinian Christians of Orthodox or Melkite Catholic communities joined the Roman Catholic Church, which is the vast majority in Chile, the Orthodox churches there have grown large enough so that the Antiochian Orthodox Archbishop oversees 7 parishes in that country as well as one from Peru. So St. Mary's, which was founded in 1978, was the second Antiochian Orthodox church in Santiago. The current priest is Padre Francisco, who you can see here, and he inherited the church sort of from his father, who was the founding priest. On his Instagram page, he's very active in social media. He describes himself first as a Christian Orthodox priest, second as someone who's worked for Palestine for more than 30 years, and third as a father of 4. When I interviewed him in July 2025, I learned that his father and his grandfather were born in Chile. So it wasn't, he has to trace back to his great-grandfather on his father's side to note the first person in their family to migrate from Palestine. Now, as a result mainly of Father Francisco's efforts, his church reflects many of the architectural and liturgical connections to Palestine. I observed 7 of these, which I'll just share with you briefly. One is a plaque in the alcove on the outside wall of the church, placed there by his father, the founding priest, in 1982, in memory of the martyrs of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon, who were massacred by the Lebanese Phalangist militia. That's a Lebanese Maronite militia, actually, who massacred Palestinian refugees with the approval of the Israeli Defense Forces, who controlled the camps at that time. So this is during the Lebanese Civil War. The second are the stones of Palestine paving the sanctuary floor leading up to the altar. These were installed by Father Francisco as a way to tangibly connect the congregation to the Palestinian land during worship. And in their tradition, they go up to the front during communion, so it's especially, I think, profound for them walking on the stones of Palestine as they go up to receive communion. There's also a Palestinian flag showing in the display window of the Orthodox store connected to the church. They also told me this is the only Orthodox store in Chile, so it's something unique. The flag is placed near a necklace that was for sale with a pendant that merges the Palestinian flag and the keffiyeh, which is the black and white checkered scarf that's a symbol of Palestinian identity. These images are from Father Francisco's office, and they include a wooden box. So it's kind of like a miniature museum to his heritage, actually, both his religious heritage and his Palestinian heritage. There's a wooden box crafted in the Middle East, directed with mother of pearl, that contains the soil of Palestine. There's an Arabic prayer book with the birth dates of the children in his family, reaching back for generations. There's a cross-stitched Palestinian flag. There's an enlarged framed photo in the middle of his great-grandfather's passport from the Ottoman Empire when he migrated. The fifth thing I noticed was on the bulletin boards and the entrance leading to the church hall. There are 2 kind of framed bulletin boards. One explains aspects of the Orthodox faith, and the second contained 2 pages of a Palestinian embassy report with updates on the numbers of Palestinians martyred in Gaza in the West Bank between October 7th, 2023 and June 24th, 2025, which was shortly before I visited. Above the report is an image of a man wearing a keffiyeh and waving a Palestinian flag, and an image of a large plume of smoke rising above the Gaza city skyline. Number 6, as I found when attending the church's worship service in July, prayer for the Palestinians killed in Gaza, especially children, has become a regular practice for this congregation. And you can even view that on YouTube in Spanish if you'd like. And then finally, the church's educational ministry has focused on Palestine for years. So its YouTube channel, for example, contains several programs in which Father Francisco, wearing a keffiyeh, explains the history of Palestine and present-day realities for the benefit of Palestinian Chileans who might not know their history, as well as new members of this Orthodox church who aren't of Palestinian descent. And it's interesting, this is a community that's actually receiving a lot of converts from Chilean society who aren't Palestinian or Arab. So what does Palestinian Christian identity mean for Orthodox Chileans like Father Francisco, who are of Palestinian descent, or for those who have themselves migrated from Palestine more recently? This is how Father Francisco answered the question when we spoke in his office, where he opened the mother-of-pearl box that contained the soil of Palestine, and he touched the soil, calling it the most precious thing that I have and my most important treasure. And he told me, "This is earth from my homeland in Palestine, and every day I touch it just to feel where I came from. My family came from this place, and this is for me so, so, so important to know that I came from a holy place. It's not just any place, it's a holy place. Therefore, I have to remember this every day, to be very proud to understand this, and also to fight every day for the inheritance that I have." So he and the other Palestinian Christians that I met in Chile and the Orthodox community, they're in some ways very far removed from their ancestral homeland. By generations, for example, they've become fully part of Chilean society. And yet their sense of connection to Palestine is central to their sense of identity and to their Orthodox tradition. So watching the violence in Gaza from afar has motivated them to respond in various ways. So with that, I'm just going to close with the words of Mitri Rahad, the Palestinian theologian that I mentioned before. These are words actually that he wrote to in a foreword to a book that I published in 2024. And he said, "Without peace, Christians will continue to leave the Middle East. Without peace, it will be difficult to keep Christianity alive in the lands of origin." And so, although I'm delighted to have been able to visit a lot of Middle Eastern churches, to see that they're thriving, to learn from people's stories and histories, and to know that there is a place preserving Middle Eastern Christianity, I think we also need to continue listening to the voices of Christians who are living in the Middle East, and to see what they need for day-to-day survival, and to ponder a little bit more deeply the possibilities of peace, and if there's any way that we individually or our congregations or our communities and our nation can contribute to that. So with that, I'll close and be happy to open for any final questions.
Could you comment on any ecumenical movements in the Middle East amongst Christians, Muslims, and Jews? And so on?
Oh, ecumenical movements. Okay, I was going to mention the Middle East Council of Churches, which is a Christian ecumenical organization. If you go to mecc.org, you can learn a lot. That organization does also partner with other religious organizations ecumenically, but I think one starting point for ecumenism for Middle Eastern Christians is just to get all of them together, because if you remember our chart, how diverse it is, and they're finding, more and more that they need to be able to support each other. What's happening in Palestine itself, you don't have, I think in a lot of these places, the more that politics divide, you don't have people living alongside each other as neighbors. So you'll find Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims living together and being able to work together, but they don't live next to Palestinian or live next to Israeli Jewish neighbors, because Israeli Jews that are in Palestine are settlers, and there's no communication, right? So there are organizations that are working for that kind of communication, and I can send you some more examples, but it's a tough question. Okay.
Is there any networking among, say, like political movements, like women's rights, say the progressive Muslim and the progressive Christians unite under that piece, equality or that type, or government to move that?
There's an organization called Women in Black, and I think it's also in the U.S., but it's Jewish and Arab women, or Israeli and Palestinian women, and they're present in Israel and Palestine. And I think that you find these in other places, in Egypt, Coptic Christian women and Muslim Egyptian women, coming together. I think there are a lot of small ways that these communities come together across difference. The question is if these small, on the ground efforts can reach up to the political level and influence things.
Isn't part of the reality in the West Bank in particular, how the cities and the areas have been so isolated one from the other, intentionally, but it makes it very difficult to do anything collectively across some of these cities or larger communities.
Yeah, I don't have the maps. We could spend weeks and weeks going into the history of Palestine, but if you look in terms of the areas where, if you're a Palestinian Christian in the West Bank or a Palestinian Muslim in the West Bank, where you can actually move to see family or colleagues, your movement is very restricted by walls and by checkpoints. And so you're right. Online collaboration would be a lot easier than in person getting together, even in the West Bank.
For those that have come here to the United States, is it fair to say that effectively they've assimilated as Americans and they lose, let's say, a desire to go back to their roots, that they're, and potentially become apathetic toward what is going on back home, back in the land of their origin?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I'm trying to answer, and I think because the communities are so diverse and widespread, and the time of their family's immigration varies, it really varies, from person to person. So I would say, people who migrated in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, I have heard their their children and grandchildren talk about we wouldn't speak Arabic in the home because there is a pressure that if you're an immigrant, you have to become American, whatever that means, right? And for them, it meant my kids have to speak English and we have to do everything like to show that we belong. I think with more generations coming from the Middle East and the establishment of cultural centers and the reality that, man, it would have been fantastic if I grew up learning Arabic. There are more people who are retaining their those languages, or children of immigrants who are going back to try to learn Arabic, to try to trace their family history. So what I'm finding is it seems like for young people, the farther they are removed from their heritage, the more they actually want to connect to it. And of course, that's not everybody, but you find people kind of, I think there are waves within the generation.
As you talk to Father Francisco, and he's fourth generation, third generation born in Chile, is that right? And he talks about touching the soil and that connection to the back, but did you get a sense that he really wanted to go back, or that he wanted to be able to go back and help? And what is that church doing? Is there something like sending food, whatever, to Palestine?
Yeah, so when he was in seminary, he traveled to Palestine for the first time. I think he saw his great-grandfather's home, and he, I think it was a transformative moment for him where he thought, I'm Palestinian. I'm Chilean, but I'm also Palestinian. He told me that he said to his wife, Chile is not our home, this is our home, we should stay here. But he didn't stay there. So I think it's, I think that his home is in Chile, but he's serving at least partially Palestinian community, and I think he sees part of his role really as educating, and then his view is, he says a lot of things that I think would be construed as political, but he's actually not trying to shape political policies. He's trying to inform, and then I think maybe let his congregation.
Is his wife Palestinian origin?
I'm trying to remember. So I think his wife is of French heritage, but it could be Palestinian with French, with French background.
Speaking from the tradition that I come from, the Armenian Protestant Church, there's a very strong American, I guess it would be Armenian American organization called the Armenian Missionary Association of America, and they retain strong ties to the Armenian Protestant churches all over the world, including Aleppo and Beirut and Cairo, all over the world. So
there are ways of retaining that
that
connection.
They communicate on a very regular basis and send support to these small Protestant communities.
Yeah, and I think it's very similar in other Middle Eastern churches where there may be fundraising for different, to support different needs that they're finding in their home countries, and it's not necessarily because they still have family there, but there's a connection from their church to to different parts of the Middle East. So yeah, so I think you're right that some people do lose connection, and often that happens when they leave the church, when they're not. They might just go to a regular Protestant church. You have to make more of an effort to remain connected to your cultural heritage if most of the people you're worshiping with aren't from that heritage.
And that's common of all immigrants.
Yeah, but I think that there are important efforts in these churches to remain, to keep those ties, or to teach Arabic on the side, or to take, a lot of Egyptians take mission trips back to Egypt, and so the kids of later generations get the chance to see the sites, the monasteries, but also kind of reconnect, even if they feel fully American, they also have that connection to the Middle East.
But the reality for the Palestinians, they cannot return.
Yeah, so
when I went in 2005 with a group of Presbyterians from Atlanta as part of a mission, or it was a trip to understand why it was that there was a Presbyterian answer to hunger. Why it was that the Palestinians were suffering so much. And we met with bishops from all of these different denominations, and almost all of them said that they had family elsewhere, but the family could not leave. And within their own family, they had sons and daughters who were wrestling with whether to leave, but they knew that if they left, they could not come back, and they would never see their family again. So that was a really the whole thing has been very divisive of families, and of course, right now, miserable.
Yeah, so for
Genocide.
Palestinian communities, sometimes you can't ever go back. If you're of multiple generations and you can show that you're a Chilean citizen, then maybe you can go back. Most of us could visit Palestine without any problem, but people who can trace their heritage to that region can't. And there are other Middle Eastern communities, refugees from Iraq, for example. When you have certain refugee status, you're not ever expecting to be able to go back home. So depending on the political situation back home, some Middle Eastern Christians in the diaspora, they travel back every summer. That's often the situation for Egyptians, for example. But others never expect to be able to go back. Well, thank you all for your questions and your time. Enjoy.